Welcome to the Iyun Podcast, an in-depth look at Chareidi society, Israel, and the Jewish people. I am your host, Ari Koretsky, and I invite you to join us as we confront the challenges, joys, and possibilities of Torah-centered living in an evolving world. The Iyun Podcast. Think again. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Iyun Podcast. Venturing away from the topic of the army, I want to touch on a much broader point of discussion, which is, simply put, the purpose of life. Are there disparate ways of seeing our role in this world? And correspondingly, the role of Talmud Torah, of mitzvos, and the like, depending on one's philosophical outlook and community. Does the Chareidi world, the yeshivish world, proffer a unique vision that is different and distinct from that of the centrist Orthodox world? Are the differences that we see in these communities a function of culture? Are they differences in degree or even in kind? That is the subject of our conversation today with two wonderful thinkers whose exchange first appeared recently in the online forum called thelairhouse.com. Tzvi Goldstein wrote a provocative and fascinating opening essay, which he has since followed up on his Substack with a whole series of articles. And Yaakov Resnick, a very thoughtful respondent, critiqued the original article and argued for a more sophisticated appreciation of the Chareidi worldview. I think you'll really enjoy these two delightful, very intelligent men who are sharing their thoughts on this subject. Our conversation with Tzvi Goldstein and Yaakov Resnick on the purpose of life. I'm very excited to be here with Tzvi Goldstein, a wonderful educator who we'll learn a little bit about in a moment, and Yaakov Resnick. And the two of them have had a very, very interesting and spirited back and forth on the virtual pages of the Lair House, which is a really interesting online publication that deals with a whole range of topics of Jewish interest. And Tzvi recently wrote an article there that we will get into, but dealing with issues of broad analysis of hashkafa, of kind of the yeshiva world, and somewhat contrasting that with more of the centrist Orthodox world, and really focusing on the distinct orientations therein. And then Yaakov wrote in a very erudite response, a letter to the editor, which spurred a great deal of conversation. So I thought I would bring the two of them on to discuss really the biggest questions of all, which is, why are we here? What are we doing in this world? Kind of what's our purpose, our raison d'etre as human beings and as Jews? And are there different orientations and different ways of thinking about those things? And how do some specific topics like Torah study in particular fit into those potentially disparate worldviews? So Tzvi, we'll start with you first. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Where are you at? And so forth.
Okay, so my name is Tzvi Goldstein, originally from Chicago. Went from Chicago, Skokie Yeshiva, to Yeshivat HaKotel for 3 years. From Yeshivat HaKotel to YU, learned by Rav Meir Twersky, Rav Mordechai Willig, a little bit from Rav Michael Rosenzweig, from their smicha in REIT, spent a couple of years in Kollel and Grus here in Eretz Yisrael. Since then, I taught for 5 years back in Yeshivat HaKotel, and now I'm editing Svarim for a few different publishers in English.
Fantastic. Any in particular that have been of unique interest?
Yeah, there are some really interesting ones coming out. Rav Schechter actually has a number of articles that he published a long time ago, which somebody put together and republished. So that was very exciting to work on. There's a 3-volume set on medical ethics that Mosaic is going to be putting out hopefully sometime soon. That was also just fascinating to work on. A lot of very interesting things.
Wonderful. And Yaakov, over to you. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. First of all, I'm excited to be here. And Rabari, I appreciate what you're doing. I know you are one of the original Jewish podcasters. I knew of your podcast before other people kind of hitched on your wagon. So, and I know the Tzarachian Institute and podcasts are doing great work. A little bit about myself. I grew up in the Monsey community. My family associated with the Briscoe Colel kind of community within Monsey. And as much as this conversation is about experience, that was my experience, my formative experience, as much as it's about kind of ideas. Those were some of my ideas were formed. I subsequently spent some time in a variety of the classical yeshivas. And now I live in the Upper West Side of New York City.
Fantastic. Okay. So let's get to the meat of the matter, as they say, which is this very, very interesting thesis that you advanced, Tzvi, on the last. Tell us a little bit about what motivated the authoring of that article, and then of course what sort of the primary thesis, in fact, was that you formulated.
So it's interesting. I think it goes back to kind of the way I grew up in Chicago. Skokie Yeshiva has a unique, I guess, population. Chicago in general is unique, is an interesting population where a lot of the rebbeim in the school in Skokie are, well, let's call them yeshivish leaning. It was that way 10, 15 years ago. Whereas most of the student body, you can call them more centrist or modern Orthodox. So there has to be some way to navigate how are we going to choose to teach these students in terms of hashkafa. What do we do about that? That itself is a common problem. The way the school ended up deciding to deal with it is they actually kind of took it off the table and decided that they weren't going to discuss Inyane Hashkafa as a set curriculum. We almost like didn't really encounter it. Obviously, you have the Divrei Torah and things are coming up agav, but it wasn't addressed kind of frontally or directly. So when I got to Hakotel and almost like discovered this world for the first time of Sifrei Hashkafa and Yani Hashkafa, and there's so much rich discussion here. I actually went back to one of my rebbeim and asked him, where was all this stuff in high school? This could have been so helpful and fundamental in terms of bolstering growth or kickstarting growth. Why didn't we have these discussions? Why weren't we exposed to these sources? And he pointed out, like, how exactly are we supposed to do that with their rebbeim coming from one perspective and the students coming from another? How are we supposed to navigate that? So I thought that was a great point. Practically, that is very challenging. But it kind of opened me up to these two very different perspectives. And from there, I started exploring. By my first year in YU, I was turned on to Rav Chaim of Hirsch. Quickly was brought into Rav Soloveitchik as well. And I think two of their really fundamental svarim, let's say the 19 letters for Rav Hirsch, definitely giving that framework for much of his thought. And then let's say Halachic Man and Lonely Man of Faith for Rav Soloveitchik really created this structure to show how there's two very, and I think Rav Soloveitchik actually draws this distinction as I wrote about in the article. There are two very different approaches, two very different ways of thinking about chovas adam ba'olamo, what a person is supposed to be spending his time focused on working towards here in Olam Hazeh. And there are a lot of practical nafkaminas to the way you answer that question. So it was kind of from that background and over the course of time thinking about that question, which led me to exploring these topics. So what I ended up seeing is that let's say the centrist perspective doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't get enough airtime. It's not as well known, or it's not as well sourced. People may be aware of it, and sometimes it gets lip service, but it's not really spoken about rigorously enough, or it's not really, let's say, lived as much as it's spoken about. So I wanted to get it more out there. I wanted to try to start that conversation. That was the goal of the article. There was conversation started, a lot of pushback, but that's the goal, to try to have it out there.
Now, just to kind of frame the discussion, you sort of, well, you began the article kind of in a provocative way by sort of ascribing this, I don't know, almost like a gamification to the more, yeshivish right wing type of community, that it's somewhat, that they're pursuing in a way, and this racking up what you call like mitzvah points or points at Shemayim, almost like a video game. And I guess the idea being that it's a very, very much an otherworldly or a next worldly orientation, as opposed to a more, let's call it tikkun olam, for a lack of a better phrase, not to be, conflated with other such usages. But as opposed to a focus on this world in a certain way, why do you choose to start in that direction?
Well, I think one of the rules of writing is you have to start with a provocative opener. No, I'll say a little bit more seriously. One of the triggers for me thinking about this and wanting to get it out there more is there were I think three Shabbosim in a row, maybe three Shabbosim out of four, um, when I was learning in the Kollel here in Israel, where somebody speaking on Shabbos quoted, I want to say I could be wrong, is it a Chida? Maybe might be wrong about that. It says that when you learn Torah learned on Shabbos is 1,000 times more effective or more spiritually meaningful than Torah learned during the week. It just got me thinking, like, why is that the source used, or why is that the perspective being taken to motivate people to learn on Shabbos? Is it what does it mean that something is 1,000 times more spiritually meaningful, powerful? What is that? What is that supposed to mean? And what does that look like? And whatever it does mean, why is that the motivation, as opposed to kind of falling back on what Torah is actually supposed to do for us in terms of the edification, in terms of building a person's perspectives? Like that kind of, and the fact that it was so consistent week after week, either 3 weeks in a row or 3 out of 4 weeks. This like, why is this the tool that we're using to motivate? Um, so it wasn't something which is, it's not just like this bug that I have in my head. It's something which I'm hearing in the conversation. I'm hearing it is used as a motivational tool. And it's like, why it's creating this almost like from my perspective, based on the other sources that I think we're going to get into, was almost like a negative take, I think a big picture negative in terms of the impact that it has long term on people's connection to learning, or really orientation towards Avodas Hashem generally.
So before we dive into some of the kind of like lining up the different sources, the heavyweights on each side of this discussion, Yaakov, when you read that opening paragraph, as did I, did it strike you as, say, first of all, empirically valid, A, and B, did you find it to be a sort of a, I don't know, almost like a patronizing formulation, or how did how did it land with you?
Rabari, I really appreciate that differentiation between the empirically valid and then also on the other side, kind of like what is on the actual understanding itself, the philosophically correct way. And I'm going to get to that in a second. I just want to say very briefly, I completely agree with the main thrust of the article, which was that if modern Orthodoxy has something different to offer in terms of values, the educators should be offering those and teaching those. Completely agree with that. Yes, but back to your point, Rabari, when I read the opening line, it struck me as, if I'm going to be honest, patronizing because it's untrue on an empirical level. You can really, I've spent time in the yeshivas, and clearly so have you, and no one is driven to the base medrash because they want to kind of rack up mitzvos, or even there's rarely talk about Olam Ha'Ba. You can go to, and the sign that Tzvi mentioned in the beginning of the article will never be seen on a traditional yeshiva wall. And maybe in a more modern Orthodox yeshiva, but if you were to go to the Mir or any of those, you would not see a sign about every word is a mitzvah, whether it's true or not. And so certainly when I read that, I was taken aback because, of course, we want to reinforce our own community lines and our own community values. And that's very important because the rightward drift has been written about by many people, and it's been debated in the Torah-observant journal since the 50s. And the sociologist Samuel Heilman wrote about it in 2007. And it's a point of discussion. And Tzvi's an educator, which I give him full credit that he deserves of educating the next generation of Jews. But certainly when I read it, I said, we don't have to make our points at the expense of another community. And I do think the Chareidi community brings, whether one agrees with the approach or not, or whether one wants to live it in their own life, there is a certain real sophistication to its methods. And I don't just mean in terms of keeping people in, I mean in terms of practical day-to-day, what it's accomplishing. So of course, I want to get into the sources. I also just quickly, I read Tzvi's response a couple of days ago, and I do think he misinterprets and misrepresents the Nefesh Chaim's kind of outlook on these things. Again, we're going to have this discussion, but so the reason I'm coming on is less as an educator, because I'm not, but more as a pursuit of truth matter. So either way.
Okay, hopefully we're all here for the pursuit of truth, and I love the forthrightness and candor. And so let's get into that, because I think what was really interesting in the way this sort of ended up unfolding was that there was kind of these like arrays of sources kind of pitted against each other. That there's this what Tzvi originally called the kind of like the Ramchal approach, and it was subsequently critiqued and maybe modified to maybe the Nefesh HaChaim approach by both Yaakov and Chaim Goldberg in another letter. And I want to kind of understand, like, are we dealing with sort of two kind of binary positions that are each historically valid from a Jewish perspective? If so, what are those positions, and who are the primary progenitors of each? Tzvi, let's just start with you. Coming from your angle, do you see these as sort of two distinct schools of thought, traditions within Judaism, and who would be the prime proponents of each?
Yeah, so if we're presenting it as a Olam Haza focus versus an Olam Ha'Ba focus, so I think it is hard to see that as anything but a binary. Once you bring in the Nefesh HaChaim, and I think Yaakov, you pointed this out in your first letter, the Nefesh HaChaim is a different way of understanding the Chareidi community, the yeshivish community. You could say it's a different, let's say, it's a different section of the Chareidi community. I'm not sure how you would want to say it. I think the Nefesh HaChaim would not be. I wouldn't present that as Olam Ha'Ba focused. I would say that that's also Olam Haza oriented. It's just oriented towards Olam Haza in a very different way than Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Hirsch. But I think if you read the Ramchal, I'm sure we'll get into Ramchal Dar Hashem Stil Shasharim, I think there is a pretty clear binary between a focus on doing something meaningful in Olam Haza versus working in Olam Haza for something meaningful in Olam Ha'Ba. And there are obviously going to be a range of ways to work through that, and to say how much focus are you going to be putting on A versus how much focus you're going to be putting on B. But at least in the extreme senses, I think that essentially is a binary. In terms of who the principal proponents are for the Olam Haza focus, the Olam Haza orientation, so definitely in the modern sense, I think it would be Risham Shemfal Hirsch and Rav Soloveitchik. I think Rav Soloveitchik presents it as almost that binary. If I'm reading Halachic Man correctly, his homo religiosus is somebody who puts the focus on escaping Olam Haza in order to connect with Hashem in the most ideal way possible, whether that's in the Olam Salyonim, whether that's looking towards Olam Ha'Ba, whereas Halachic Man has the opposite approach. He's also looking for this closeness to God, this relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but like the Rebbe says, he travels in an opposite direction. As opposed to trying to leave this world behind, he's trying to pull HaKadosh Baruch Hu down into this world. And the way he does that is through the prism of, really through not really the lens of, using Torah, using mitzvos in order to bring the Kadosh Baruch Hu down into this world. So that's Rav Soloveitchik. I think for Rav Hirsch, it comes through really. I want to say all of his writings. He if you look at the 19 letters, I don't think there's a single reference to Olam Ha'Ba, to Schar and Olam Ha'Ba. It's almost like not even on the table for him at the time. Obviously, it's an important part of the bigger Jewish story for him. But in terms of the 19 letters giving this basic introduction to Jewish thought, it's not something, I could be wrong, but I don't think it even comes up. Instead, what he talks about is what we're trying to accomplish in this world. He starts with humanity in general, which is the way Hashem created the world, with a tachlis for humanity. When that doesn't work out, through a number of iterations, we get to the Jewish people, who are meant to be helping the Olam, meant to be helping the rest of the world come back to that tachlis, the Mamlechas Kohanim, where the same way Kohanim lead Klal Yisrael, we're supposed to be the ones who are leading the Olam back to that ultimate goal. So there's the very real sense of trying to work towards something meaningful down here in this world. I think going all the way back in terms of sources, the principal source that unites both the Rav and Rav Soloveitchik is the Medrash, which is brought up in I think popularized by the Tanya, but the Medrash, which has a number of different forms to it. Well, let's say the Tanchuma in Naso, that when Hashem created the world, he wanted to have some way, some place for him to live, whatever that means, down here in this world, the way he had that before creation in the upper worlds. So if you follow that medrash, and again, there are a number of forms to it, but if you follow that medrash, essentially it starts with HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Adam and Chava and Gan Eden. Due to the sin, the Adam and Chava hear the call, Hashem Elokim mitalech bagan. So the medrash says that's the sound of Hashem leaving the Gan in response to the sin. He moves to the Rakia Rishona. The rest of the first few prakim of Bereshis is sin after sin after sin, and Hashem keeps moving away from this world in successive rakios due to those sins. Once he gets 7 levels away, I think the Tanchuma version of this medrash says that Hashem brought about Avram Avinu. Hashem decided he was too far from us and he wanted to start coming back, so he brought about Avram Avinu, like the Zohar, I think the Sfas Emes quotes about the call of Lech Lecha being out there resonating throughout the world, and Avram is the one who heard it. Hashem put out the word for that he wanted to start coming back, and Avram was the one who heard that message. And then from Avram, basically down for the next 7 generations, down through Moshe, Hashem comes successively closer back through those rukios. The end of this medrash is Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai at the time of Matan Torah. It's not just Hashem coming down to deliver the Torah, but it's actually Hashem coming down and rejoining our world. So there's this grand epic from Gan Eden, where Hashem wanted to be together with humanity in the garden, the failure, the mistakes, and then finally coming back in through Nesinas Torah, through Kabbalah Torah, is how Hashem rejoins this world. So the idea that Torah, essentially what that medrash seems to be saying, is that Torah is what allows us to build, to create this dira b'tachtonim for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way it was supposed to have been originally. And again, this medrash, this Tanchuma in Naso, juxtaposes that with the Mishkan.
Fascinating.
The symbolic representation of a dira b'tachtonim is us building the Mishkan. It's obviously not just the Mishkan itself, it's v'shahanti b'socham. This is a project that we're supposed to be working on for the entire world, not just the 20 amos, the way a different medrash says, the 20 amos of the Mishkan itself. But that's the kind of the 2 ideas, Torah and Mishkan juxtaposed together. That's how we're meant to engage in this project of building a dira b'tachtonim for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So both the Rav talks about that a number of times throughout Halachic Man. Rav Hirsch talks about the medrash as well. Perek Gimel in his commentary to the Torah in Bereshis, I think again, I want to say in Vav maybe, I could be wrong, but I think again in Vav, he brings up that medrash. This is kind of the common marmakum for both the Rav and Rav Hirsch, highlighting this project of of focusing on our mission, our focus being developing Olam Hazeh to bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu down here.
Yaakov, my question for you is, do you believe that there is an actual divide? You referenced at the beginning that you are you're very comfortable with the idea of there being kind of called a modern Orthodox or centrist Orthodox position. You just want it to be an accurate portrayal, or that the more Chareidi position to be portrayed accurately. Do you believe, in fact, that there are kind of 2 different ways of looking at things? And if so, what is the more quote unquote Chareidi position, given that it's not how you believe that Tzvi characterized it in his piece?
Yeah. So just a quick word, and it may sound like a preliminary point, but I think it gets to it. And I'm glad Tzvi mentioned Rav Hirsch and Rav Soloveitchik, which is, by way of illustration, I'm going to make this quickly. If you were to go to a bookstore right now in Teaneck, New Jersey, or Cedarhurst, and you would go to the hashkafa section, you would find many books titled "What is Judaism? What is Modern Orthodox Judaism?" I've read many of them, and they lay out a philosophy. What is God? What is creation? What is the purpose of the Torah? It's my view that the very act of systematizing, the very act of a comprehensive philosophy put into pages is somewhat antithetical to the Chareidi way of thinking. And it's not because of laziness, right? So if you were to go into the Chareidi section of hashkafa, even in English, you're going to find halachic works, but in English, you're not going to find what is Judaism, what is God. There's a reason for that. And let's take the greatest, by way of illustration, you could take the greatest figures in the modern Orthodox world. If you use it capaciously, as Rav Hirsch, Rav Soloveitchik, as you referenced, Tzvi, they wrote 19 letters, Chorev, or Halachic Man, Lonely Man of Faith. They're philosophical tracts. Their main works are what is Judaism, what is the purpose of man, sometimes theological tracts, what is God. Not so if you take the main figures in the yeshiva world, and there's just so many, but they're either works, halachic works. You could take Rav Yisrael Meir Kagan, that's the Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, or others. They're not philosophical tracts. And this, I think, gets to some, not laziness or Haredim aren't capable of thinking comprehensively. It gets to some fundamental points about in my opinion, the limits of philosophy and the limits of language. That's a different conversation that I just wanted to plug, because a Chareidi listener might say, this just doesn't sound right, this conversation, talking about what is. We don't have those conversations, and they're right. They don't, right? This is somewhat of a strange conversation that's not had, and there are reasons for that I have. But let's get to it. I do think that the Chareidi, when Tzvi wrote, I can't take a poll of what do more people follow the Mesilas Yesharim or Rav Chaim of Volozhin, I think it's important to remember that the yeshiva world, the Chareidi world, is quite large, and there's many different ways of thinking. But if we're going to take specifically the yeshiva world, is a progeny of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, right? On his deathbed, he had two requests to his son. One is publish the Nefesh HaChaim, which was subsequently named that, and one was to continue the yeshiva in Volozhin. And of course, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, we can talk about his biography, the main Talmud of the Vilna Gaon. So when we talk about the yeshiva world, they're not a product of Mesilas Yesharim, which is read as an ethical tract in yeshivas. Even if it's laying out a philosophical view, it's read as a musar tract to reinforce people's commitment. It's not read as what the world view is, even if it contains that or if it was written like that. So yes, I'm going to talk about what I think is the product. What we have right now is the yeshiva world is a Nefesh HaChaim, and I'm very quick, and I'll lay this out in 60 seconds. When we think about Torah, Torah can be located at its source. Where does Torah come from? And the Kabbalah, obviously, as Tzvi mentioned, has four worlds, right? And this is central to Rav Chaim of Volozhin, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, Asira, Asiya. And before Rav Chaim of Volozhin, most people located Torah as part of the highest level, Atzilus, I think. Now I'm like blinking up. Atzilus, the highest thing. And Rav Chaim, in short, comes in Shar Daled, which is the most important part of Nefesh HaChaim, and writes that no, Torah is not from Atzilus. It's from Ein Sof, which is the eternal, which is God himself. And this actually has serious consequences. And it's a big difference between Hasidim and Yeshivish and others if Torah is from Ein Sof. One of the consequences of that is what I wrote. If Torah is from Ein Sof, that means all other four worlds that we just mentioned, Atzilus, Bria, etc., flow from Ein Sof. So they flow from Torah. So when a yeshiva mashgiach gets up and says the Nefesh HaChaim quote that Tzvi mentioned, which is that if we were to stop learning Torah for a second, the world would cease to exist, that is quite literally a belief, right? This is actually the physical reality, right? Because the world, Asiya, our world, the physical reality, flows from Ein Sof, which contains God and contains Torah, right? According to Shar Daled.
And Rav Chaim set up mishmaros, right? And Rav Chaim set up mishmaros 24 hours to make sure that there was always somebody running in Volozhin.
Exactly. Bidiyuk, right? And this is
is 100% a reality.
It's exactly. So it's just a reality, and it has many, many consequences. I think one of the consequences is a little more philosophical, which is it becomes that the purpose of Asiya, which is this world, flows from Ein Sof. So flows from God and Torah. So the purpose of this world is Torah. So in Shar Aleph, Rav Chaim writes that, of course, we know the machlokes and brachas of Rav Shimon ben Yochai, and Nova Safta as the Genacha. So in short, right, for listeners, the Gemara says, no, right, we have to gather our grain. We have to go out there and make an occupation. Rav Chaim in Shar Aleph says, of course, right? But via Safta as the Genacha while you're thinking about Torah. So do a very light physical occupation, pretty much, so that your mind can be preoccupied. Because again, that is the telos of all creation. So there's lots to be said about the weight of mitzvos versus Torah. And really in Tzvi's second letter, I think you kind of mixed up some of mitzvos and Torah, which to Rav Chaim, one of his, again, bold declarations was that no, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam is actually Keneged Kulam. You mentioned the part of Rav Chaim where it's Keneged Devarim, each mitzvah. When he goes on to say that when you learn Torah, it actually perfects the whole body. It's not a cutesy vart that Torah is so much greater than mitzvahs, it perfects the whole body. It's an understanding that the mitzvahs as we have it now actually flow from Torah. And their holiness, which is a bold declaration, actually gain holiness through the Torah. So whereas the mitzvah is connected one aver, the Torah, which gives its holiness, gives its kedusha to the mitzvahs, is can I get all evarim, and so on and so forth. So there's many practical ramifications of Torah versus the other mitzvahs, and what Torah Lishma is. But in my mind, if you're going to look at the Chareidi world, you may be able to ask someone and they may not be able to kind of spell this out, but I think this is certainly what guides people, right? And I mentioned this in my first piece, which is, and I think I have a Nefesh HaChaim open, so let me read it because it's so beautiful, honestly. Uvishasa Asek va'in b'Torah, I'll read it in Hebrew and translate out after. Vishasa Asek va'in b'Torah, vadai she'ein sarach az le'inyan hadvekas klal. Shebe'asek va'in lavad hu davuk b'ritzono v'dibura yisbarach v'hu yisbarach v'ritzono v'dura echad. The point is that Devekus, which is the concept of I want to connect to God, you don't even need to think about connection to God in this way of thinking, because God is Ein Sof, the Torah is Ein Sof. So merely occupying yourself with the Torah is an occupation with God without a conscious thought of that. So my view is that when you think about the real priority and esteem which the yeshiva world holds Torah in, it is kind of indisputable that this is the view they're taking, not just because the Chareidi yeshivas as we know them flow from Volozhin, and what exactly was the novelty of Volozhin. There are many books on that also. But, it's important that the primacy of Torah, and I'll end off with this, is not based off a cute vort. And it's not either based off, we don't want people straying outside the line, so we're going to kind of create Torah and a culture around it so people don't go kind of stray too far. It's because Torah is the telos of all creation and it precedes all creation. So that, I think, is a short, kind of very compact way of describing maybe the philosophy of the Chareidi world.
It's a beautiful articulation, Yaakov. I'm curious, what would you identify as the antecedents? In other words, Nefesh HaChaim, we've been talking primarily very modern thinkers, right? In the scheme of things, Tzvi, of course, recourse to a Tanchuma, among other earlier Midrashic sources, Dir B'Tachtonim, which I enjoyed the fact you quoting only a couple days after the Rebbe's 30th yard site. Of course, a very, very, that kind of talk about the telos of Chabad. That really is a defining ethos and telos of Chabad. But, where would this Nefesh HaChaim approach be found earlier, much earlier? Chazal, Divrei Chazal.
Yeah, I mean, Divrei Chazal, it's full of it when you read through Nefesh HaChaim, but I mean, part of it flows from his concept of Torah Lishma. So in the last parak of Avos, where in depth it goes through what Torah Lishma brings you, part of it is, the first mission there says, Rameir says, these are the benefits of Torah Lishma, and at the end says, it brings you above Masehem, or some language like that, I'm forgetting. And Rav Chaim translates that not Masehem like, worldly deeds, which certainly it does. It brings you above mitzvahs. And through this, he builds, how does Torah bring you above mitzvahs, that you don't need to kind of engaged in mitzvahs anymore? Well, if Torah is from Ein Sof, and he quotes Rav Chaim Vital, obviously, he quotes the Zohar many times over and over. I actually think it's less, and quotes so many different Chazal, and I can pull them up and quote them to you. The story goes, again, part of my systemization, Chazal didn't systematize. It doesn't mean they didn't have a hierarchy of values. But even when you're learning halacha, the very act of codification, which is a different discussion, is met with resistance, right? Rambam's Mishnah Torah is met. So Chazal were always wary of codification, both when it came to law and when it came to philosophy. Mor Nevuchim was obviously met with resistance. So we're always going to be kind of collecting and choosing different Ma'amrei Chazal, and Rav Chaim has a difficult time interpreting some, like, right, the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasadim. How would Rav Chaim answer that? Right? It seems like Gemilas Chasadim and is equal to Torah. So Rav Chaim has a whole answer. Maybe that's before Har Sinai and one's after Har Sinai. So I think personally, it's less important to get into sources, which there's always going to be. I think there's a joke about the Panovich Yeshiva where the Mashgiach, well, it's not a joke. It's a story. The Mashgiach came up and, gave a beautiful Divrei Chizuk based on a Mishnah and Abbas. And the Masmid came to him after and said, but what about this other Divrei Chazal, which has the complete opposite? And he said, internalize this one, and then we'll come up with an answer to that. So I know that's kind of dodging the answer and providing a little, but yeah.
Tzvi, any thoughts?
Yaakov, you started saying that there's not really much of a there aren't many major philosophical works in the Yeshivish world. That's just not how they wrote. I think everybody, tell me if I'm wrong, I think everybody points back Dafka to the Nefesh Chaim as like the prime example, or like the main source of exactly this, philosophical works that kind of provide this fundamental perspective for the community. It's almost like they don't need to write anymore because they already have the Nefesh Chaim. So I think there pretty clearly is this the same philosophical thinking. If you want to say that Rav Chaim wrote it as a response to Chabad philosophy, to the Tanya being written as parallel or similar as the ideas might be, Herschel Schachter likes to say that a large majority of the content is basically the same with some nuances, some differences. There definitely is the same philosophical thinking. And I think it's hard to say that you're just going to skip to Shar Dalid and skip the introduction to the book. Obviously, Shar Dalid is coming in context. Shar Dalid is the one that talks about Torah, and from a worldview where Torah is the most important thing, I can understand why people say that Shar Dalid is the most important Shar. And when I was in yeshiva, I was told also by Rosh Yeshiva that you don't really need to read the beginning. You can just skip to Shar Dalid, and that's the important point about Torah. But you obviously have to take these farm in context. I think I was working with Mesilas Yesharim as well. I don't want to downplay the importance of Mesilas Yesharim in the Ramchal. That's not just a cute word. It's not just a tactic to get people to be excited about Talmud Torah. That is I think, a well-recognized philosophical approach to why Hashem created the world, because the Kadosh Baruch Hu is a native. He talks about this more in Derech Hashem, but it fits very nicely with what he writes in Mesilas Yesharim. Kadosh Baruch Hu is a native, and he created the world in order to have an audience, or to have people to receive his hatava. And that's what he says in Derech Hashem. Mesilas Yesharim, saying that we're created lisanei Hashem le'anos miziv shchinaso, is actually facilitating the accomplishment of the purpose of creation, the purpose of the Bria, of Hashem actualizing his nature as the ultimate native. So it's not just this is something which we can tell people for them to feel like they're going to get ultimate schar. This is one of the legitimate approaches to the Kavanas Habriya. I think the ramifications of that perspective, the way I wrote it in terms of racking the points, is obviously a crasser sense, and I think I clarified in the essay. If I didn't, I should have. But I think obviously what the Mesilas Yesharim is saying is that it's a question of dveikus b'Hakadosh Baruch Hu through the mitzvos. If it's Derech Hashem makes this, I think, clearer, but you're perfecting yourself in Olam Hazeh through the practice of mitzvos, so that when you get to the Olam Ha'Emes, you're more in a position to have that fuller dveikus, which leads to or facilitates that ultimate Hana. It's not often presented that way, at least from the sichos that I'm hearing. It's often presented as, let's do as many mitzvos as you can, and let's avoid the averos because they take away from the schar mitzvos, Olam Ha'Ba, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's obviously what lies at the core of what the Ramchal is saying. So I don't want to just dismiss the Ramchal as a cute board or as not a serious philosophy. I think it very much is a serious approach. But when we're so the context there is obviously very important as well. You kind of have to start with that opening parak, Chovas Adam B'Olamo. His point there, even if we leave aside the actual tachlis that he lays out, I think the point itself of knowing what a person's tachlis is crucial. It's hard to think of any sort of educational system, or it's hard to think of a person doing anything that's really meaningful without really understanding what his tachlis is, what he's trying to accomplish in doing that. You can say that we're commanded beings and we're just supposed to follow the commands without really understanding why. I think the Rambam more in has strong words about that approach. And I think the Rav Chaim does give the answer to that question. He does explain what the tachlis is, how all this kind of whole picture fits together in terms of what the goal is and how the different parts facilitate that goal. If you look in that opening shar, he says that Hashem created the world, like you said, with the four Olamos, with him as the neshama, as the source of the koach of all four worlds, and Torah being parallel to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in providing that koach. And what Hashem, the empowerment that Hashem gave us as a Tzelem Elokim, which is the opening shar, is that we're the only beings, we're the only creations that have the ability to impact all four worlds, because we have an neshama that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Therefore, there's this almost like a line, a power cord that stretches from HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Ein Sof all the way down to us in the Olam Ha'asiyah. And we're the only ones who are able to impact all four worlds. So we can do that in a limited sense through Asiyas and Mitzvos. We can have this. And he uses I think the parallel language of Shutfin B'tachtonim. That's another one of these midrashim which works very nicely. Not Dira B'tachtonim, but Yisav HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shutfin B'tachtonim. Hashem wanted to have partners down here in this world. I think that one is actually in the context of B'niyas HaMishkan. So the Nefesh Chaim uses that medrash, I think, a number of times throughout the Sefer. So we are the only ones who can actually be those shutfin b'tachtonim by being mitakein all four of these worlds through our asiyas and mitzvos. And then he gets to the impact of Talmud Torah, like you said, which is so because it's rooted in HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, because it occupies the space in the Ein Sof as opposed to in any of the other worlds, even the world of Atzilus. Therefore, our connection to Torah, our asika b'Torah, has you can call it a juggernaut effect. You can have a gestalt effect. It's not just being attacking one specific prat, the way a mitzvah is attacking one of these metaphysical evarim. It's somehow able to impact the entire system as a whole. So I think that starting from the first shar, I think that the Nefesh Chaim has a similar perspective in terms of we're trying to be attacking something in Olam Hazeh, but it's much narrower. It's not about building a society. It's not about building a dir b'tachtonim for Hashem to come down to and somehow inhabit, whatever that means. The way I think the Rav and Rav Hirsch would say it, it's much more focused on the metaphysical impact of mitzvos, and then much more broadly, much more powerfully, Talmud Torah itself. And I think he actually describes that as experiencing Olam Ha'Ba, Gan Eden, in this world, right? And I think he has that language.
Yaakov, do you see the divine, and I'm happy for you to respond, but just as sort of a trigger question, and you take it where you'd like, do you see this divide down the line as kind of this, sort of classic rationalism versus mysticism approach? Is Nefesh Chaim is a mystic, and he's coming from this, perspective of otherworldliness and of metaphysical, I'm not going to call it points because that again has that patronizing sort of implication, but okay, but building one's neshama for eternity and tapping into the ethereal, tapping into the transcendent versus sort of the rational of creating a just and great moral society, in this world. I kind of think of, in the way that Jonathan Sachs would write about it. And of course, Rav Hirsch and Soloveitchik and so forth. Do you see that as a clean kind of easily assignable kind of two sides to the equation, or is it more complicated than that?
Sorry, I just want to say, I don't think Nefesh Chaim would say it that way. I don't think Nefesh Chaim would say that it's about raising your soul to any sort of higher levels. I think he would say that it's about making tikkunim through all of the olamos in this world. It's not this self
fair, but that only compounds the point that it's more of a metaphysical impact than
that part I agree with. Just to be
yeah.
clear that it's not about working towards something for yourself in the higher worlds. It's about having that impact as a partner to God in these four worlds.
Yeah. Yaakov, thoughts?
Yeah, so first two brief responses to Tzvi, which is one, certainly you have to read Shar Aleph of the Nefesh Chaim, and I agree with much of your characterization there, although when he gets to talk about Torah Lishma, it does muddy the waters a little bit, because what exactly Lishma is, an important question. Second, certainly Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, puts forth a comprehensive philosophy in Derech Hashem. The narrow point I was making is that my understanding, I may be wrong, is that when people in the yeshiva world read it, they read it as an ethical tract, as a Musar tract. Now, maybe they are lowering its status by reading it not as it's meant to be, but I was kind of making an empirical observation. I think, to your point, rationalism and non-rationalism, there aren't even clean breaks there, because people like, calling Mor Nevuchim sort of a rationalist tract, and it is, but there are similarities there in understanding, right? Because like Rambam, for example, also elevates Torah study as a be-all, end-all. Now, his definition of intellection, right, and reaching the highest points of understanding obviously differs from the Nefesh Chaim, but it also is based on some sort of, one can say, premises that maybe not everyone would consider rationalistic if they were, let's say, looking at them now. But I do think, yes, I mean, it's certainly, right, the very concept of Kabbalah is based on what people like saying in anti-rationalistic premises, whether it's true or not, right? You can't see the world Yetzira or Asiya. These are things that we take as true. And through that, he constructs a worldview and how we should act. But if one were to be taking the rationalist track, yes, he isn't, right? Because rationalists, like many of the Rishonim, the Kuzari, are going to elevate mitzvos either to the level or even greater than Talmud Torah. At least say, Torah Lashma is Torah Shemevi Lidei Maisa. As Tzvi pointed out very nicely in the beginning, and actually his beautiful essay, which I think is very nice when it's dedicated to, and of course the first mitzvah is naming the animals, and there's so many sources for that, and you can really, and I think in my response, I said, like, the discussion has kind of been, had ad nauseum. There's endless sources for, is it meant as a perfection in this world, or is Torah good in itself and really has nothing to do with perfecting this world? But I do think that Rav Chaim's premises, obviously in the Kabbalah, and his elevation of Torah above mitzvahs rest on what some people would call anti-rationalism. But I'm not sure those terms are really so important, as opposed to really, which I agree with Tzvi, is the practical implications of the two, right? One leads you toward that. And I also want to make one more point, which is, a lot of people look at these two communities and they say it's a cultural phenomenon, right? I mean, take two guys right now in America. They both wake up early for Shacharis, learn a little Daf Yomi first, take a train to the city, work, catch a mincha, of course, go back home, put their kids to bed, eat dinner, do a night seder, right? The same two people. One goes to Young Israel and one goes to Yeshiva Charedi shul. They're doing the same exact thing. What's the difference? It's a cultural phenomenon. One, has a little more reverence, maybe whatever, you can split the culture. And I think that's an important point to be made, because when we talk about, we have to talk about our similarities. I know there's a big movement post October 7th, we're really one community, we daven in the same minyan, Eidach Hanem and B'Yisurin applies. I would eat by your house, you would eat by mine. So it's important to say that there sometimes is a cultural thing, but I think it goes beyond that. I do think even when they're learning at that point, right? As Tzvi very, very eloquently said, they may have two different kind of intentions or lishmas when they're sitting and learning that Daf Yomi before taking a train. So the differences could be small, but they could also be profound. Yeah.
Do you think that there's reason to understand that one of these worldviews leads to a greater degree of insularity? What's the connection between, whether you want to call it a more mystical worldview, this more Lishma Nefesh HaChaim type of worldview, versus the more centrist perspective that relates to a notion of openness and versus cultural insularity?
Yeah, I'll answer that briefly, and I'll have Tzvi talk about it. I'm sure he has thoughts, but it's obvious that if you elevate Torah study above all else, even above mitzvahs, and Torah Lashma is Torah not Shemevi Lidei Maisa, it's not Torah that I'm going to have a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's Leman HaTorah, right? Which is a difficult concept to grasp, but I'm learning L'Shem the Torah for this entity that exists in Ein Sof. If you really believe that, you believe the physical reality flows through that, there really is no need. And it's not only that, it's counterproductive, it's counterintuitive to engage in anything else but that, which is why I brought up that part, which I always find remarkable in Shar Aleph, which is even when you're working, even if you have to do Vasafta de Gnecha, make sure it's just some physical work so that your brain can still be toiling in Torah. So, and Rav Chaim actually has some choice words to say for people that could dedicate themselves toward Torah and choose not to. And that's, again, if you elevate Torah, it's not even just to make a geder, right? There's one view, we have to make a geder and we want to keep the community pure, so we're not going to engage. It's anything other than Torah is pointless and actually takes away from it. And in a way, yeah, can contaminate the Torah. So I think this really, and I don't want to get too deep into divisions, but some people, and sometimes I'm of that view that a lot of the bitter disputes of modern Orthodoxy and what you call Chareidi Judaism in the 20th century, which we don't see anymore, right? Even if the communities are still somewhat separate, we don't see the type of language that was used toward the modern Orthodox institutions, and maybe the view that the modern Orthodox had toward the yeshiva world of being less than. We don't really see those type. but they were getting at something important, right? It wasn't just, is definitely to police community boundaries, but there was a fundamental understanding that the mixing of Mada, that the mixing of things other than pure Torah contaminates it and is counter. Yeah.
Tzvi?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about the rationalist versus non-rationalist point?
You pick up whichever thread is most compelling.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So just I think to talk about kind of like nafkaminas of the approach. Where is this really just two guys who are basically doing the same thing, and the difference is these smaller cultural differences, but you don't really have really significant practical nafkaminas. So I think it's much greater than that. Context-wise, these are conversations that I had often with guys in yeshiva who are looking kind of like towards that next step, going off to university or continuing learning. And it was exactly this point that they were trying to figure out. When I'm trying to plan out the next 5-10 years of my life, should I be looking towards the goal of developing Olam Ha'Ba and setting myself up to accomplish that, or should I be looking towards this goal of Torah Lishma and going kol kulo into Talmud Torah, which is obviously going to come at the expense of the developing Olam Ha'Ba perspective. So this is kind of a fundamental question, which is meant to really touch on all aspects of a person's life. And when you're making these bigger life decisions, that's where you're really going to have this opportunity to take two different paths, which leads to very different places. So I think I dramatized the difference, but like for one example, in terms of choosing a profession. So a person who feels like he has a unique, he has the kochos to be a psychologist. He has the kochos to be a doctor. He has the kochos to be an accountant, a lawyer, whatever it is. That's obviously going to take a significant amount of schooling. It's going to take a lot of time. If instead of being 5 years in kollel straight learning, he's going to be, let's say, a YU type of schedule where we'll have a morning seder, night seder, and afternoon seder. Instead of being in the beis medrash, he'll be in classes. So that's a significant question. What am I supposed to do about that? So if you see the ultimate goal, the tafkid, the tachlis hachaim, as being somebody who facilitates to this, let's say, Jewish community who are oriented towards the Torah's values, and by incorporating halacha and the values of halacha into day-to-day life, so you've built a society which can be the stira b'tachtonim. So then that ideal Jewish society is going to need accountants and lawyers and social workers and psychologists and doctors and and all those people who are fully shakua in Torah as well. I think one of the nafkamim, maybe we can get to Talmud Torah, how this plays out in Talmud Torah also, but I think it changes the type of Torah that a person would be learning, both in terms of style and also in terms of subject matter. But these people obviously need to become as Talmidei Chachamim. They need to be fully invested in learning, not just the Daf Yomi. They need to go beyond that as well. But it means that you should be spending that time to understand what your skills are, what your kochos are, and the way the Chovos HaLevavos says, the mitzvah of La'avda L'Shamra, you should be looking to accomplish that. Whereas the other side would say, yes, you may have the skills for that, but what's the cost? What's the downside? How much is that going to take you out of learning? And is that a cost that we're willing to pay? And if the focus is on kol kulo Torah and Torah Lishma, and there's a viable way to support your family without having to give up that time, whether that's this is stereotyping, and I'm not in this community, so maybe it's not fair. Ari Yaakov, if you think it's not fair, then cut this from the tape. But the stereotypes they say of selling on Amazon, or the cash advance, or the meat boards, or whatever the in thing is right now in the communities where they're not taking the time for like the white collar professions, the blue collar professions. So then that would seem to be a much more natural choice, where you can get into those things with just a few weeks of training, and you can be in learning till late 20s, till 30, until you even have to get started with that. That would be the natural choice, because we don't see the value of osek b'yishuv shalom in developing the stira b'tachtonim with halachic values. So I think that's one of the most consequential decisions. Should I be trying to maximize my kochos that are God-given, which Hashem gave me? Should I be looking for opportunities to use them? And that's part of this building an ideal society? Or should I be looking to maximize my Talmud Torah time, even if that means putting aside those potential kochos? It's too much of a cost that we're not looking to spend, and I'd rather just maximize my Torah time and get into something which pays the bills, even if it's not necessarily facilitating that positive contribution to the world.
You're on
You're
mute.
muted.
I want to ask Yaakov because I do think the theology that Tzvi is formulating here, and obviously not his own, of course, but um, the weakness, I guess, relatively speaking, from my perspective, of the Chareidi approach, philosophically speaking, again, is that this more, again, call it centrist, and it's a silly word because, the Hirsch wasn't, I don't think, waking up and saying I'm a centrist. He was, saying I'm Evan Hashem. But okay, let's call it that. The strength of that approach, or the weakness of its opposite, is that it's a more comprehensive or encompassing or embracing theology. In other words, it accounts for more in a certain way. It accounts for one's personal talents and proclivities. It accounts for natural phenomena and various dimensions of the world. Whereas the more Chareidi approach is, we're kind of ignoring those things. Those are almost distractions or even Yetzer Haras in a certain degree, and it doesn't. There's no way to really talk about or even think about phenomenon that are not within the four walls of the base medrash. Osik b'yeshuva shel olam, so to speak. My personal interests, my personal needs, my personal talents. Do you agree with that characterization, Yaakov? That there's something that's difficult about that particular type of theology? It doesn't seem to encompass the totality of our human experience.
Yes, I mean, I see the point you're getting at. The issue with this point is that it's true, and people fill in for that, and I'll explain what I mean. The same point could be made about the Moreh Nevuchim, meaning when the individual is at the center of the conversation, then the individual has to be accounted for, right? If you're going to center the world as it currently is, constructed and its challenges, then we're going to want to see answers directly on that. And of course, the Torah contains all answers. But if you're going to lay out a grand theory of creation and of truth, it may not account for, individual kind of proclivities or what have you. And I don't think that's necessarily an issue, as I see it. I think we've seen in the recent years, and part of this is certainly, due to Jewish history, which I'm not an expert in, but coming out of Eastern Europe and moving to America, and, the move, maybe past post-World War II, and where we now see many, let's say, Charedim or people from the yeshiva world going out to work in the world, that there has been Sfarim published on trying to fill in these gaps. So obviously, Rav Aaron Lapiansky wrote a very influential sefer years back. And what he was getting at with that sefer is, yes, we've provided a worldview of Torah supremacy, which is still true, right? He's not going to take away from that. But let's talk about your role as a Ben Torah. When you go out to work in the world, how are your talents? And if we're going to be honest and practice, that's what I said, people don't choose a job even necessarily as maybe Rav Chaim would want and think even while they're doing Amazon, of the latest Chiddush. But so we fill in gaps for that, but it doesn't necessarily take away from the truth. And I don't think it's concerning if you believe that Torah is Ein Sof, and if you believe it as, a great philosopher whose name I won't mention said, we learn as much philosophy to get us to stop learning philosophy. So we search for answers to make ourselves feel comfortable, and then we move on. We're not getting at the truth. We're not getting at a comprehensive worldview. So in as much as the Nefesh HaChaim is to be read as, I'm a little more of an intellectual guy, I want some sort of system of why people are driving me to the base medrash. This doesn't make so much sense. Someone says, well, Ein Sof, it's very nice. You don't even need Dveikus. Okay, good, fine, But if you believe in it as a matter of truth, then I don't think any gaps that it may not fill are concerning. I think, we go fill them ourselves. And this applies to Moreh Nevuchim and many other ways of thinking. I do think, as Tzvi mentioned, and again, I'm not a community leader. Everything has its excesses, has weak points, and the move toward materialism, which Tzvi alluded to, could be as a result of the primacy of Torah. And when one is not living to its true ideal, right? Like, by the way, Rav Chaim did, right? Rav Chaim was not a material person, if you know anything about him. He was a giant. So were many in asceticism and not taking worldly pleasure. So yes, there's a danger of when the focus is on the pure and the true, and then people can't necessarily attain that, then they end up getting perhaps a bit more materialistic and a little more into excess. And again, that's for their community rabbi to extol the virtues of not engaging in that. But I don't think it either gets to the truth or gets to the merits of the Chareidi way of life. So I think that's just every community has its issue. You know, in Eastern Europe, the issue was that we were starving and we didn't have rights and we were being killed. And that didn't necessarily get to the truth of any given philosophy. And I think the same too here. Hope that's a little responsive.
Yeah, I mean, there's also what also speaks to is this seeking for a purity of ideology. It also tends to become more elitist, right? Because there's only a rarefied few that can actually attain that at its peak levels. And where does that leave everyone else? So in Tzvi's, again, representative worldview, right, that leaves people with a lot of options because that's not, that's only one, maybe that's, one track, but there's many tracks in this more Chareidi, and this critique of the Chareidi society would be, where does that leave most other people? And a person might feel, okay, well, then I will just go and indulge in other ways because I want to be great at something, So I'll be great in money, and then by the way, giving a lot of stock with that money, but also maybe in indulging in a great deal of material access as well.
Yeah, let me just actually quickly, because I think that's a great point. And I used to joke around with a couple of friends of mine that it's so much easier to be modern Orthodox. Why? If you're ever curious, am I being a good Jew? You can open up one of the books and say, am I living in accordance with the principles and values that, let's say, modern Orthodoxy proposes? And many of those will lay out exactly what you're doing. I think there was a debate in the Torah-observant journal in like the 60s, like, is vacationing in Italy a true act of Torah-observant? And, you can actually like fit everything nowadays neatly into is this. But obviously we know that when someone in yeshiva or someone that's now working but is a yeshiva light thinks about, am I being a good Jew? They don't really have a system. They think, well, am I learning Torah? And they have to come up with the answers. And they, maybe they'll reference a Rav's speech about how being a good husband is the end of all creation. And that's why, by the way, I'm glad in the beginning of the conversation you said the purpose of life, which is a little more philosophical. I thought you were going to say what you said in your email, the meaning of life. And that I was going to say, that's an individualistic question. And everyone's going to come up with their own. You're going to hear one Rav say, and this is in the Chareidi world, the meaning of life is being happy, or the meaning of life is being a good husband. And the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur wasn't, he was getting dirty, his hands and in the Avodah, and so to hear. And I think that's true. And it's an individualistic question, and people will tap into what speaks to them. But that's, maybe on a grand theory. I think what I kind of propose today is a little more of a driver, a little more of an abstract level of what truth is in this community. And then on a more individual level, a more communal level, based on whatever circumstances we're living in, we fill in the gaps and we provide the answers. That's my view, but I think that's a good point, is what you were saying.
And just one more point, Yaakov, because you did mention it earlier, and I do want to kind of tug on this thread. You mentioned that in the Chareidi world is more averse to codification or to classification. My theory would be that it's because there's a sense that Torah needs to be preserved on some level as a Torah Shabbal Peh, and that there has to be that it's to be a Torah Chaim from Rebbe to Talmud, and of course the same way that the Mishnah and the Gemara and then ultimately all of these things throughout, of course, the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, and all these things were opposed. So in the same way, this is kind of like a furtherance of that opposition. I don't know if you agree with that, and if you do, does that fit neatly into kind of the way we've been talking about that, or is that almost like its own side, kind of point to the matter?
Yeah, this is an interesting question I've been thinking of in recent months. And as you mentioned, right, like Torah Shabbal Peh, we shouldn't be written down, right? Isser, Eis Lasas Lashem, Sacha. We have to write it down. We need to preserve it. And what is the hesitation to write down Torah Shabbal Peh, right? Why can't you write it down? And what is that hesitation to codify in any sort of comprehensive and easy to read manner, right? Like, I mean, that's why when you think about, I don't want to use this word because I'm afraid maybe listeners will like almost the extreme or the radicalism of Mishnah Torah, of codifying, and he comes up with separate things that aren't a Masechta, right? Hilchos Tshuva. We don't have Hilchos Tshuva. where in the Gemara is Maseches Tshuva, and for many other things also, right? So when you codify, first you end up changing a little, as you're saying, you change from the Torah Shabbat Peh. But I do think you're right, that Torah is essentially, even if there is a systematic way of thinking about it, there is a limit to language, is how I read it. And the Torah Shabbat Peh is not just Peh as in the words I speak to you, right? It's Shimush. It's learning from the Rebbe. Gadol Shimusha Yoser Melamuda, the Gemara says. And that's not like a cute thing, like there's truths that are contained that you can't necessarily put into words always. And this isn't to say that, oh, if you can't put it into words, it's clearly not a truth. I don't think that's true. And this is not just in Jewish philosophy that people say this. And I think that's what it's getting at, the kind of, the suspectness of categorizing, of systematizing. And then Tzvi said, no, but Nefesh Chaim is. And maybe, well, first, that's a break, I think, in my view, and I'm sure people disagree with this, at least in the yeshiva world as we know it. And second, I think the point that nothing's been written since, because it's the only we've never had that tradition where one person writes the final tract, right? Mishnah Torah tried, right? In this introduction, you're not going to need anything else after this. And obviously that's just not how the Jewish tradition has evolved. We always write more. So the fact that no one wrote Nefesh HaChaim number 2, like the Shulchan, like the Shulchan Aruch and its predecessors did to displace, quoting, I don't mean displace the Mishnah Torah, goes to show that there is something that is suspect. Now, if you want to place it, why did Nefesh HaChaim write it? There are many historians that have different views. Was it in response to Rav Shneur Zalman's work? Was it in response to other things? I don't really care about those things. I care more about what he wrote. But yeah, I do think what you said is true. There is a resistance, and it's for a good reason.
Another theory, Tzvi, might be that one could attribute it to the influence of Western culture and of a greater openness or receptivity to secular culture or secular modes of learning have a corresponding impact on the Torah learning itself. So, there's a reason that, let's say, all these 10-minute halachas coming out of the YU based medrash, of Ari Leibowitz and things like that, where you have these and I've always enjoyed that, you go on YU Torah, you have very organized, systematic presentations of different topics in a way that you don't necessarily get in the yeshivish world. And again, there's so much, cultural borrowing nowadays, and the lines are much more porous than they ever were because of technology and, and mobility and things like that. But Tzvi, what are your thoughts about that? Do you feel like there is a certain an external influence on the methods of distilling and communicating Torah that actually makes the sort of the centrist approach more organized and presentable?
Are we talking about disseminating Torah generally, or are we talking about this idea of are we able to put words to a tachlis specifically?
I think in general, the idea that, we're mentioning that Yaakov has argued that organized or codifications or tracts themselves, it's the lack thereof is not a bug, but rather a feature of Chareidism. And whereas in the modern Orthodox world, classification and organization versus the Rav, and learning was like this, obviously, to an extreme, that it's all about finding that appropriate classification and the right designation. Is that a function of some sort of externalized influence, or where is that coming from? Is that related to the overall philosophy, or is that just some sort of sociological phenomenon that exists there?
I'm not sure. I'd probably argue it's more sociological. I think the important difference, at least that I see, in terms of the derech halim, of the style of learning, that both the Rav and Rav Soloveitchik, both the Rav and Rav Hirsch talk about, and to a certain extent to themselves or exemplify themselves, versus you can call it the classic Talmud Torah or Talmud Torah in the more yeshivish world, is this assumption, is this feeling that Talmud Torah needs to be oriented towards Maisa, and that's not just in the sense of Psak Halacha, right? Talmud Gadol Shmei de Maisa, or the Rambam Marsha as well, say that the reason that Tam Torah K'neged Kulam is because of this orientation towards Maisa, because Tam Gadol Shemegel de Maisa. So what does that actually look like? It's not just because we need to know what to do practically to make sure we're not breaking the law or that we're doing the mitzvahs properly. The way the Rav says it in the end of Halachic Mind, which I think then gives context to Halachic Man, is that Halacha uniquely, and Gemara more broadly as leading into Halacha, gives a sense of what a person's worldview is meant to be. It sets a person's values and perspectives on all different aspects of life. Out of the sources of Halacha, a new worldview awaits formulation is that famous last line of Halachic Mind. Hirsch talks about this as well, I think in letter 10 of the 19 letters comes back to letter 18, that Torah needs to be something which guides our perspectives. Torah milashon hara, from instruction in terms of hara, in terms of conception, where it creates a seed for the vision, which is going to be for the personality, which is going to be birthed through this development down the line. So Torah learned with that in mind leads to, I think, a very different perspective on how a person's supposed to be learning and what they're supposed to be walking away with. For example, we mentioned different possible professions. Chaim Goldberg, right? Rabbi Chaim Goldberg, who you had on the podcast recently did an interview with Rabbi Professor Dr. Avram Steinberg, who is currently working on the Encyclopedia Talmudit. So in that interview, he's very well known in terms of medical halacha, medical ethics, things like that. One of the points that he made in that interview is that let's say professionals who are strongly rooted in learning have an incredibly important role to play, both as in terms of assisting Rabbanim for Psak Halacha. It's well known that, say, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach or Moshe Feinstein would consult with experts in the field for helping getting the sense of the facts on the ground before giving a Psak. So somebody who has the understanding of both the facts on the ground and also the halachic facts on the ground is obviously a huge asset there, but also in terms of being mechadesh, in terms of contributing to the halachic discussions in the field, knowing the facts on the ground and being an expert in both the Torah sugyas and the facts on the ground, the Mada, the let's say that side of the equation, is able to make a contribution to the practical halachic guidance, but also in terms of the values that come out of the sugyas that other people just can't make. So when we talk about a person having a chelik in Torah, you can actually see how that works. You can actually feel inspired to pursue that. If you can recognize what your, let's say, unique kochos are, you can recognize what your, assuming that's going to translate into a career, you can say, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to focus on the sugyas of medical ethics, medical halacha. And my chelik in Torah is going to be at that intersection, at that crossroads where my interests and the topics in halacha that relate to it kind of come together. And that's a contribution that I can make to the Torah world. If you're taking the perspective that Torah is much more abstract, Torah Lishma is what we're learning Kachim and Taros just as much as we're learning the practical areas of Torah, and it's not really at all about coming to Talmud Gadol Shmei Maisa. It's just about engaging with this source of Ein Sof. So then it's much harder. This is a practical point. I think it's an important one. It's much harder to really feel inspired that you can make a meaningful, significant contribution to the world of Torah, because what am I going to come up with that was not already said in the thousands and thousands and thousands of svarim, which are in every base medrash and every Yotzar svarim, and almost everything that is going to be said has already been said. And what contribution am I going to make with my limited amount of time being osek in whatever topic? Whereas if you're taking the Soloveitchik reverse approach, where you're meant to become an expert in the field that you're being osik in, that you're focusing on, so you actually can make a meaningful contribution there. So it's a very different style. It's a very different approach to learning. The goal of looking for halachic values, the goal of looking for what are the perspectives and ideals that kind of mark this society, which creates a dir b'tachtonim. I think it's much more relevant to a much broader swath of the population, as opposed to the more abstract perspective, which I think, like we said earlier, is much more elitist, right? It was Rav Dessler who said that the yeshivas are built in such a way which it sacrifices 1,000 individuals for the sake of the one gadol. I think a centrist would shudder at a statement like that. Like,
Right.
how can you say that 999 members of Klal Yisrael are being sacrificed on this mizbeach for the sake of the one gadol? Hashem created a Klal Yisrael of 600,000 individuals, and each one is supposed to have their chelek to contribute to the broader picture, and to only look for the gedolim as important as the gedolim are, not to downplay that at all. But in terms of the tachlis, how can we set up a system where we say, was it Rishon and Gamla, was Zachur Latov for making sure that there was no child, the original, no child left
No
behind.
child left behind that.
And
There
now,
you go.
exactly,
Yeah.
the original, no child left behind. But now we've set up a system of yeshivos where we're prioritizing this elitist figure, the gadol shabbagedolim, who can actually make this meaningful contribution at the expense of everybody else who's not going to be able to actualize that.
Okay, so and we have very few minutes left. I just want to each of you in 1 to 2 minutes. This is more of a personal question in a sense than a grand philosophical, but it touches on the philosophical. We see that there are sources again arrayed on each side. We could spend weeks just lining up all the sources that support either one of these approaches. How does a person individually adjudicate? Is it simply a function of what resonates? Well, resonance may not even be that valuable, at least in the system that Yaakov's describing, who says that resonance is what matters. Maybe it's just grand truth, right? And so how does one make a determination? It's just where you happen to be born, the Rebbe you happen to have been drawn to, at a certain, formative age. Yaakov, start with you. And again, 1 minute, and then Tzvi, we'll close with you with a minute and wrap this up.
Yeah, I'll just conclude and answer that, but also just say, I commend Tzvi. He's obviously a Rebbe, and he's training the next generation of Torah-observant Jews, and that's amazing. And modern Orthodoxy is compelling. I recommend every listener to read the Sfarim by Rav Lamb, Rav Sachs, Rav Lichtenstein. It is some of the most interesting, some of the most sophisticated Torah one will come across. And ultimately, this is the way to answer the question. And you read some of the other Torah coming out of what you want to call the yeshiva world, and it's compelling as well, and it's beautiful, and it's meaningful as well. So I would encourage, every listener to go read as much as you can, listen to as much as you can, and really, go over to every person and learn as much as you can from them, both, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever it is. And people are sophisticated most of the time if they're associated with the community, and let's treat everyone with dignity and learn from everyone, because trust me, everyone has something to offer. So read all you can, listen to all you can, and hope everyone.
And is it ultimately just a sense of what resonates most with you, or is there some other way of determining, like, what do I do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's a good answer to that. I think it's obviously what you think the truth is. And the way to get to the truth is to read and rethink. And why do we see people making changes in their 40s and 50s? Not just emotional changes and new difficult in 60s and 70s. And then we have the Talmudic passages of people on their deathbed. So I think truth resonates with people at different times of their life. And there's compelling visions of what truth is, and everyone has to kind of just read and think for themselves what they think is true.
Tzvi, 1 minute, bring us home.
I'm gonna make a appeal. There are sources on both sides. That's 100% true, like we've discussed. The side that I'm staking out is to say that Hashem created the world with a specific goal in mind. He wants us to do something. He's calling for us to be his shutfin b'tachtonim. He wants us to be his partners in developing a society that reflects his values as he encoded them in the Torah. The only way we can actually accomplish that is if we all together understand that that's the goal, and we each find our way of contributing to that goal. Right? The Klal Yisrael was built as 12 shvatim. Two of those shvatim were set up to be the Talmidei Chachamim, really the Mechanchim, right? Lahoros es Yisrael, Yorum Mishpatacha Yaakov Resnick Yisrael, Kisif Sekon Yishmudas Torah Vakshim Piu. We need our Mechanchim, but a majority of Klal Yisrael are the ones who are taking the Torah that they're getting from Talmid Chachamim and actualizing it in their lives through their professions. We need the people who are Nisa'o Livo, right? The ones whose hearts raise them up to go contribute to building that Mishkan. Like we've said, that Mishkan is the microcosm of that Dira B'tachtonim. So every single person has some way to contribute if they take this on. If we can all take on this goal together, of recognizing we're meant to be the Shotzim B'Tachton. There is a role for you to play. You can make a meaningful contribution both through your Torah and through your ASEC and your Osek B'Yeshuva Shalom. And I think that really creates the sense of a unified Klal Yisrael where we can all respect the contributions that each person brings to the table, because even if we are being Osek in different things, we're all working towards the same goal. We want to talk about Achdus as an ideal. We want to talk about reflecting Hashem Echad to the Achdus of Klal Yisrael. I think taking on this perspective together is one incredibly powerful way to do that. When we have the same goal in mind and we can work on that same goal together, we can all recognize each person makes their own unique contribution, but we're working towards the same goal. We need every person to take this on so we can actually accomplish that.
Tzvi Goldstein, Yaakov Resnick, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ravari. Very much.
Thank you very much, Ravari. Thank you, Yaakov.